The year was 1588 and Catherine de Medici was approaching 70 years of age, a formidable lifespan by the standards of 16th century Europe. Yet the woman who had once commanded courts outmaneuvered princes and dictated terms to kings was now witnessing the collapse of everything she had spent her life preserving. France was in flames. The wars of religion which she had spent decades trying to contain had intensified beyond control. Her third son, Henry III, sat uneasily on the throne, increasingly reliant on desperate, often brutal methods to retain power. The Valois dynasty, once the pride of the French crown, was teetering on extinction. Catherine's health was failing, but she remained obsessively engaged in the kingdom's affairs. She was a queen mother who refused to disappear quietly into widowhood or age. Instead, she clung to influence, sending letters to foreign courts, managing the estates of the crown, and acting as the mediator between her son and the fiercely militant Catholic League. But time had begun its conquest. Her legs ached, her eyesight dimmed, her face once remarked upon for its dignified austerity was hollowed by fatigue and pain. Still, she pressed on, determined to shield France and her family's legacy from complete collapse. Behind her tenacity lay a woman molded by trauma. Born in Florence in 1519 into the Medici banking dynasty, orphaned as an infant, she had survived years of political imprisonment and upheaval in Italy. Married off at 14 to the French Dauphin Henri, she endured a loveless marriage, decades of humiliation and intense scrutiny for her Italian background, and suspected pagan sympathies. But after Henry II's death in a jousting accident in 1559, Catherine had emerged as a shrewd regent and the real power behind three successive Valois kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. By 1588, however, her influence had waned. Henry III had grown increasingly unstable, his rule marked by political assassinations, erratic decrees, and confrontations with both Huguenots and Catholics. The assassination of the powerful Catholic leader Henry, Duke of Guise, allegedly sanctioned by the king, sparked national outrage. Public trust in the monarchy cratered. Rebellions erupted across the kingdom. Rumors swirled through the streets of Paris, and the chambers of Blois-Catherine's family was cursed, the Valois bloodline poisoned by its own sins. Some whispered it was divine retribution for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, a slaughter she had orchestrated to eliminate Protestant influence at court. The Queen Mother now lived in a state of constant dread. Messages arrived daily detailing the collapse of royal authority in various provinces. Cities once loyal to the crown had pledged themselves to the Catholic League, or worse, declared independence. Catherine wrote frantically her letters, still marked with the razor-sharp intellect that had long defined her diplomacy. But even her written words began to carry the weight of desperation. She pleaded with her son to show restraint, to reform the court, to reconcile with alienated factions. Yet Henry III, distrustful and increasingly isolated, rebuffed her advice more often than he heeded it. To add to her torment, Catherine's body was betraying her. Her appetite diminished. She suffered from chronic stomach pain and swelling in her lower abdomen. Her legs retained fluid. Servants noticed a sickly odor trailing her movements, and her sleeping hours grew erratic. Physicians steeped more in superstition than science applied poultices and purgatives, diagnosing her with everything from melancholic humors to internal corruption. None could help. Her own private alchemist, a holdover from her earlier fascination with astrology and occult science, quietly suggested the problem was spiritual rather than physical. As the year drew on, Catherine became increasingly paranoid. Her bedchamber was guarded at all times. She suspected poison in her meals, betrayal in her letters, and espionage in the very walls of the palace. She moved between palaces in search of safety, but each relocation only further exhausted her. Her trusted retainers began to die or desert her. Several of her old allies, like the Duke of Nevers and Michel de l'Hôpital, had either retired or succumbed to natural causes. She was left surrounded by sycophants or enemies, often indistinguishable from one another. The palace itself had turned hostile. At Blois, where she would soon spend her final days, tensions among the nobility were palpable. Henry III had called the Estates General in a last-ditch effort to consolidate power, but the assembled factions were more interested in condemning the monarchy than rescuing it. Catherine, still hoping to act as a mediator, found herself ignored, even mocked. To many of the younger nobles, she was a relic of another era, a woman whose cunning had caused more bloodshed than peace. Yet Catherine refused to recede. Her sense of duty twisted, though it may have become compelled her to remain active. She met with nobles, delivered speeches, and dictated policies from her bed when necessary. It was during this period that a grotesque and deeply unsettling ritual was reported by a chambermaid Catherine, it was said, had taken to burning small effigies in her hearth. Late at night, wooden figurines representing her political enemies, accompanied by murmured incantations in Italian. Whether this was true or courtly slander, the story spread quickly, reinforcing the image of a queen mother who had crossed into desperation, even madness. Throughout all of this, one theme remained constant: the collapse of the Valois. Catherine, whose primary goal had always been to preserve her children's claim to the throne, now faced the likely extinction of her dynasty. Her eldest son Francis had died young. Charles IX had gone mad, tormented by guilt and paranoia after the St. Bartholomew's Massacre. Now Henry III faced the wrath of both Huguenots and Catholics. With no surviving sons and no direct Valois heir, Catherine's life work was unraveling before her eyes. Even her surviving daughters, Marguerite of Valois and Elizabeth of Valois, had been sidelined, one locked in exile, the other long deceased. The political marriages Catherine had so carefully arranged had yielded no enduring alliances. Spain, the Habsburgs, and the papacy looked upon the Valois throne as a failed project, ripe for replacement. By the winter of 1588, Catherine's own attendants could no longer hide their unease. Her condition worsened. She required assistance even to walk. Her skin became pallid, her eyes sunken. She rarely ate. And still she worked, dictating letters with trembling hands, determined to die as a queen in control, even as death encroached both on her body and on the kingdom she had tried so hard to hold together. By the beginning of 1589, the decline of Catherine de Medici was no longer an abstract matter of age or overwork. It was physical, visible, and unrelenting. Her health deteriorated rapidly, following the Estates General at Blois, which had concluded in December 1588. Within weeks of returning to her quarters, Catherine was bedridden. Her joints ached constantly. Her lower abdomen remained swollen and tender to the touch, and there were growing signs of internal infection. Fevers spiked irregularly, her urine turned dark and foul-smelling, and her breathing grew shallow. Attendants noticed she often mumbled incoherently during sleep, and sometimes while awake. The Queen Mother, once one of the most politically active figures in France, was now confined to her bed for hours at a time, sometimes days. Still, her mind remained razor-sharp. She dictated correspondence from her pillows, correcting secretaries for misquoting her or mishandling syntax. She demanded updates on troop movements, financial reports from royal tax collectors, and the names of any court nobles who had pledged allegiance to the Catholic League. But her physical form was in rebellion. Her legs swelled so badly that servants had to elevate them with silk cushions soaked in vinegar. Pustules appeared on her inner thighs, and hips abscesses so sensitive that she would cry out when touched. The physicians suspected advanced intestinal cancer or a spreading septic condition, but could do little more than drain boils and prescribe laudanum for pain. The court doctors were a pitiful cohort by modern standards. They lacked understanding of infection sterilization or anatomy. Their methods, often a mix of Galenic theory and superstition, relied heavily on purging, bloodletting, and bizarre rituals. One insisted on suspending bunches of rue and wormwood in her chambers to purify the air. Another recommended placing a live pigeon on her stomach, believing it would absorb the toxins in her blood. Catherine tolerated these humiliations not out of hope, but because refusal would be interpreted as weakness. And weakness, she had learned over a lifetime, invited betrayal. Her room, once richly decorated and perfumed, began to reek of rot. The curtains were drawn to hide the pale winter light, but the stench of infection was inescapable. One servant fainted while changing her bed linens. A visiting priest refused to hear her confession until the chamber was aired out. Yet she refused relocation. The Queen Mother insisted on remaining near the political heart of the palace, so she could be consulted on matters of state even from her bed. To her, illness was a strategic liability, one to be hidden, managed, and exploited when needed. Her relationship with her son, King Henry III, grew increasingly strained during this period. Once dependent on her counsel, the king had begun to pull away. Catherine saw it as both a personal betrayal and a political error. She sent him letter after letter from her chamber, sometimes affectionate, sometimes scolding, She warned him that his enemies in the League were multiplying and that his harsh reprisals were isolating him further. He responded with vague platitudes or worse, silence. Rumors circulated that he resented her involvement in the murder of the Duke of Guise, despite her previous denials of complicity. Worse still was the king's deteriorating public image. Pamphleteers across France, especially in Paris, depicted him as effeminate, heretical, and even sodomitical. These images often included his mother as a sinister figure whispering into his ear an Italian witch, controlling the throne through spells and poisons. While Catherine had long been vilified for her heritage and her political manipulations, the accusations were now more vicious and widespread than ever. One particularly grotesque tract depicted her lying in bed suckling demons while dictating orders for assassination. These texts, printed in secret presses and passed from hand to hand, fed into the growing notion that France was cursed and that Catherine's very presence sustained the corruption. Her few remaining allies, such as the Duke of Epernon, grew uneasy. Some recommended moving her to another estate for her final days, but Catherine refused. She believed even as her skin bruised from simple touch, and her voice dropped to a rasp that her presence in Blois was essential. She clung to the notion that by sheer force of will, she could prevent Henry from alienating the last remnants of the nobility, and perhaps even salvage a Valois future. Amid this grim decline, a peculiar and deeply disturbing episode occurred, one noted in the journals of a chamber scribe, and corroborated by letters from the Archbishop of Lyon. A peasant woman from outside Blois, claiming to have had a vision of the Virgin Mary, was brought to Catherine's chambers by a group of superstitious courtiers. She was said to possess the ability to heal through touch and prayer. Catherine allowed the visit. What followed, according to observers, was a bizarre session in which the woman screamed, writhed, and declared the Queen Mother to be devoured by serpents of guilt. Rather than expel her, Catherine ordered the woman paid and asked for a second session. Whether out of desperation or some desire for penance, she sought further contact with the mystic, only to have the woman vanish before the next visit. No one claimed responsibility for her disappearance. The court, meanwhile, was consumed with tension. The Estates General had collapsed without resolving the crisis of succession or restoring public confidence. Several delegates returned home in disgust. Those who remained did so either to scheme or to spy. Assassinations became routine. One nobleman was found strangled in his bedchamber, another stabbed near the chapel steps. Catherine's once imposing presence no longer offered protection to those aligned with her. She could not even protect herself. One morning in early January 1589, she awoke after a fitful night and was unable to rise. Her muscles refused to respond. Her attendants carried her to a chair by the hearth, where she sat motionless for hours, murmuring about her dead children. She spoke at length about Charles IX, who had died raving and bloodied after years of mental torment. She recalled with sudden lucidity the way his hands had clawed at invisible enemies in his final hours. That image, she said, haunted her dreams. Her decline had become unbearable not just for her attendants, but also for those who depended on her for guidance. She could no longer write, so she dictated short phrases to secretaries who strained to catch her whispering voice. Her once imperious tone was now punctuated by confusion. She asked for people who had been dead for years. She repeatedly demanded to see her husband, Henry II, whose death she had witnessed 3 decades earlier. When the priest finally returned to deliver last rites, Catherine wept not from fear, it seemed, but from exhaustion. Her death, when it came, was slow. Unlike many monarchs who expired suddenly by blade or illness, Catherine de Medici eroded. She died not in fire or rebellion, but by 1,000 degradations, each one more intimate and humiliating than the last. The queen who had once ruled France through force of will now barely registered her own name. Catherine de Medici's body, once regal and poised in its stately black mourning dress, had become the battleground for a final relentless siege of pain. The Queen Mother, though long plagued by minor ailments and recurring fevers, now suffered from a far more severe and insidious condition, believed by many modern scholars to have been colorectal or intestinal cancer. The exact diagnosis naturally eluded the physicians of her time, but the symptoms were unmistakably grotesque and thoroughly debilitating. Her stomach bloated to unnatural dimensions, causing her constant discomfort and restricting her ability to eat. Even sips of broth or watered wine provoked cramping and nausea. Any movement triggered spasms of pain radiating from her lower abdomen into her hips and thighs. The skin around her belly grew taut and shiny, discolored by deep purple bruises from internal bleeding. One physician, upon examining her, noted an unwholesome warmth and putrefying motion in the lower viscera, a phrase that today would suggest a necrotic tumor or severe infection. But the most distressing detail documented by palace attendants in private correspondence was the odor. Despite the application of rose oil herbs and vinegar-soaked linens, Catherine exuded a sour, feculent stench that lingered in her chamber and clung to her bedsheets. The likely cause was a perforated intestine or abscess that had begun to leak into her abdominal cavity. One maid remarked that the stench was so strong as to draw tears to the eyes before even reaching the threshold. To mitigate the worst of it, bowls of burning incense were kept permanently lit by the bedposts alongside sachets of lavender and clove. None of it worked. Compounding the physical torment was the breakdown of her bodily functions. Incontinence plagued her. At first, it was sporadic, managed discreetly by her closest ladies-in-waiting. But in the final weeks of her illness, the condition became constant. Her bedding had to be changed multiple times per day. The soft pillows and silk-lined mattresses that had once signified her station were now soiled and stripped repeatedly. The Queen Mother, once one of the most powerful women in Europe, was confined to a nest of damp cloth and antiseptic herbs, barely able to lift her arms, let alone command a kingdom. Even within the walls of Blois, her deterioration was both a private agony and a public embarrassment. The noblemen of the court still gathered after the Estates General whispered about her decline. Some avoided her altogether, fearing contagion or the symbolic discomfort of witnessing her vulnerability. Ambassadors from foreign courts recorded in their letters home the decay of the Queen Mother's frame and influence. Catherine had become both physically fetid and politically obsolete. The physicians attempted everything within their limited arsenal. Leeches were applied to her lower spine. Poultices made of honey mustard seed and crushed walnut were spread across her belly. Her urine was examined daily, its dark color confirming worsening kidney function. A Spanish doctor even attempted to insert a crude metal tube into her rectum to relieve internal pressure, an intervention that left her screaming in agony. No treatment slowed the disease. Instead, the interventions became part of the horror, each one adding insult to injury, trauma to pain. During lucid intervals, Catherine still issued commands, demanding letters be written to distant nobles or foreign envoys. But her voice was weak, and often she forgot names, reversed dates, or failed to finish thoughts. Her once celebrated memory, sharp enough to recall the genealogies of every European dynasty, was eroding. She mistook servants for dead family members. She asked for Charles IX to be summoned, only to be reminded gently that he had died over a decade prior. She stared blankly at her own reflection in the mirror and asked if it belonged to her mother. Despite the agony, Catherine refused to surrender the trappings of royalty. She insisted her hair be combed and her body clothed each morning, even when she could no longer rise. Her ladies-in-waiting, now more nurses than courtiers, wrapped her in velvet gowns and arranged jewels on her wrists, even as her fingers thinned to skeletal frailty. The sight was ghastly, a woman draped in the grandeur of monarchy, while her body dissolved beneath the silk. As the illness consumed her, so too did the memories. Catherine began to speak aloud to people long dead. Her husband Henry II, her rival Diane de Poitiers, her murdered sons, and the victims of her political machinations. She returned again and again to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Witnesses recalled her muttering prayers in Italian, followed by long, whispered apologies. One evening, she startled her attendants by screaming, "Blood on the cobblestones. The Seine, it carries them all." These were not simple hallucinations. They were echoes of a life filled with violence and hard choices. Catherine had ordered murders, sanctioned purges, and manipulated courts to preserve her dynasty. Now, with her legacy disintegrating and her body succumbing to decay, those ghosts refused to stay buried. Her confession to the priest, given in halting speech and sometimes incoherent fragments, was reportedly extensive. The cleric noted in his official report that the Queen Mother wept when recalling the deaths of Protestant children during the Paris massacre, and that she begged God not to punish France further. Whether sincere or strategic, the confession was one of the last conscious acts of a woman who had ruled through cunning and fear. But the court offered no mercy. Her suffering was not met with reverence but with quiet revulsion. Servants rotated frequently. Few could bear prolonged exposure to the Queen Mother's chambers. Nobles prayed more for the king's safety than for her health. Henry III himself visited only twice during her final decline, each time staying less than an hour. Rumors spread that he feared she would ask him to reconcile with the Huguenots, something he could no longer politically afford. In late January, her condition deteriorated beyond hope. Her breathing became labored, her skin clammy. A large abscess ruptured near her pelvis, releasing a mixture of blood and pus into her bedding. Her body went into septic shock. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, groaning incoherently. On the final night, she reportedly gripped the bed frame so tightly that her nails splintered. Catherine de Medici died on January 5, 1589, shortly after midnight. No final words were recorded. There were no great declarations, no mourning crowds. The woman who had once held France together through sheer political calculation died in a bed of her own waste, her courtiers relieved, more than bereaved. What followed would be even more grotesque. Following Catherine de Medici's death, the atmosphere within Château de Blois shifted not to solemnity but to relief. For many within the court, her long excruciating decline had become an unspoken humiliation, an open secret that spoke not only to the personal agony of a dying queen mother, but to the waning legitimacy of the Valois monarchy itself. Her body, ravaged by disease, now lay cooling in the same palace that only days earlier had played host to executions and secret tribunals. And while her physicians whispered their final prayers and withdrew the king, and his advisors moved quickly to contain any political fallout. There was no public funeral procession, no national day of mourning. France was in no condition for ceremony. The Catholic League controlled Paris and large swathes of the kingdom. The Huguenots had rallied again in the south. Henry III, never beloved by his people, now ruled as a monarch in name only. His power base was shrinking. The death of his mother, long a bulwark of negotiation and political manipulation, left him exposed. He responded as Catherine had in her prime, by turning inward, trusting no one and moving ruthlessly. But Catherine's absence was not just political. It marked a disturbing psychological shift for the king. Catherine had been his counselor, his shield, and sometimes his scapegoat. Now with her gone, Henry grew more erratic. He doubled down on paranoia, increasing surveillance among his nobles and hosting nightly secret councils. The Queen Mother's private documents, hundreds of them, covering decades of correspondence, were sealed. Some were burned. Others historians suspect were locked away to avoid revelations that might destabilize the already fragile regime. Amid this political instability, disturbing stories began to circulate about Catherine's final days, stories tinged with both superstition and fear. The most chilling involved her obsession with omens in the weeks before her death. Attendants reported that she had demanded a daily update on the stars from her personal astrologer, Cosimo Ruggeri, a man whose influence had long been suspect. He was no mere court magician. Ruggeri had been implicated in a scandal years earlier involving poison and black masses. Though protected by Catherine, he remained an ominous figure at court, often blamed for misfortunes ranging from miscarriages to diplomatic failures. According to one account, Ruggeri had told Catherine that her death would come not when her body failed, but when the last star of the Valois ceased to shine. She reportedly clung to this phrase, repeating it in her half-lucid hours. Her attendants were instructed to track the movement of celestial bodies from the palace observatory, and the structure hastily converted for the purpose. She demanded astrological charts be laid out across her chambers alongside holy relics, papal indulgences, and alchemical diagrams. This eclectic collection part, devotional part occult, offered a glimpse into her inner chaos. Catherine had always straddled the line between faith and superstition. Raised in Renaissance Florence, she was steeped in the mystical as much as the theological. Throughout her life, she had relied on astrologers, necromancers, and magical texts not merely as curiosities, but as tools of statecraft. Now in her final weeks, these practices ceased to be strategic and became deeply personal. The symbols once used to manipulate others were now her talismans against death. Servants grew uncomfortable. One reported being asked to place powdered bones allegedly from a saint, acquired through dubious means beneath Catherine's mattress. Another was instructed to keep a basin of blackened water at the foot of her bed to trap malign spirits. These rituals, though rooted in the syncretic culture of Renaissance, Italy shocked the more orthodox courtiers of Blois. Some suspected witchcraft, others feared divine retribution. But for Catherine, these acts were neither madness nor heresy. They were insurance. Insurance against the silence of God, against the judgment of history, and above all, against the fate that had befallen her children. For all her ruthlessness, Catherine had outlived nearly all her offspring, and each death had carved a deeper chasm in her psyche. The slow madness of Charles Nene, the stillbirths and miscarriages of her daughters, the assassination plots, the betrayals. She carried these wounds like stigmata, silent, festering, and ever-present. Perhaps most telling was her late-night request, just days before her death, for the bones of her husband Henry II to be brought from Saint-Denis to Blois. The request was denied. His tomb was too sacred, the political situation too unstable, but the message was clear. In her final hours, Catherine longed not for glory or posterity, but for reunion with the only man she had ever truly loved, despite their bitter and often distant marriage. This longing, strange and sudden, caught her court off guard. It marked a softening one that she never allowed in life, but which death now permitted. Yet even as Catherine slipped into unconsciousness, the palace was alive with treachery. The corridors of Blois echoed not with mourning, but with footsteps in the night, whispered plots, and the iron creak of locked doors. Just weeks earlier, Henry III had ordered the assassination of the Duke of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal of Lorraine. Their deaths had turned many Catholic nobles against the crown. Assassins now roamed the palace grounds under various allegiances. Guards were doubled. Courtiers armed themselves discreetly. A single wrong phrase could result in exile or a quiet disappearance. Into this atmosphere of fear, Catherine's death offered no closure. Instead, it amplified the sense that the kingdom was unraveling. Her body, once attended by the finest healers, now lay in a simple wooden coffin in the royal chapel. The grandeur of state funerals was impossible under the circumstances. Paris, where the heart of the monarchy once beat strongest, was hostile to the crown. Saint-Denis, the royal necropolis, was inaccessible. Plans to transport her body were delayed indefinitely. It was said that the night after her death, a raven perched on the chapel spire and cawed until morning. The guards, terrified, refused to enter. Whether such details are legend or embellishment, they reflect the mood of the time, one of fear of decay, and of the dawning realization that an era, however dark and controversial, had ended. Catherine had long feared that the Valois dynasty would collapse in chaos. Now, with her death, that prophecy seemed fulfilled. But the horror was not yet over. Her body, like her reputation, would face indignities far beyond those suffered in life. Though Catherine de Medici had died on January 5, 1589, her body did not receive the dignity expected of a royal matriarch. The circumstances of the court, torn between rebellion and reprisals, meant that even in death the Queen Mother remained a political liability. With the kingdom fractured, royal authority contested, and Paris in the hands of the Catholic League, any movement of her remains was a dangerous logistical undertaking. The route to Saint-Denis, traditional burial site of French monarchs, was inaccessible. Instead, Catherine's body remained in Blois, a temporary solution that soon became permanent. She was placed in the chapel of Saint-Sauveur, a modest ecclesiastical space within the palace complex. There she lay not in a marble sarcophagus, but in a plain wooden coffin, hastily constructed and devoid of any royal markings, beyond a single medallion bearing the Valois crest. The delay of her interment created practical problems. January was cold, but not cold enough to prevent the natural processes of decomposition. Without embalming, rushed preparations and political distraction made it impossible. Her body began to swell and emit a foul odor within days. Servants were tasked with maintaining the chapel, lighting incense at all hours and sealing windows with waxed cloth to keep the air tolerable. But even these efforts fell short. Courtiers avoided the space. Some claimed to hear noises at night, gasps, creaks, even the murmuring of prayers. More than one guard reported an overwhelming sense of unease, a weight that settled on the chest when passing through the nave. These were likely the inventions of an anxious court surrounded by enemies. Still, the psychological atmosphere was thick with dread. The king, meanwhile, had no time to grieve. Henry III was engaged in an increasingly desperate campaign to retain power. The Catholic League had branded him a tyrant and usurper following the assassination of the Duke of Guise. The estates of Paris had declared their allegiance to the League's candidate, the Spanish-backed Charles de Bourbon. Henry III responded with further crackdowns. Executions resumed, spies multiplied, nobles disappeared in the night. With every passing day, Catherine's political legacy eroded. Her years of careful mediation between Protestant and Catholic factions had ultimately failed. Her vision of a Valois France, strong, centralized, culturally dominant, was slipping away. But her son, unwilling to recognize this truth, clung to the illusion of control. He refused to allow his mother's body to be buried outside of Saint-Denis, even if the necessary conditions could not be met. Her coffin remained in Blois, sealed and alone. The indignities continued. Within weeks of her death, a group of League-aligned clerics publicly accused Catherine of dying, unrepentant, steeped in heretical arts and courtly bloodshed. One sermon delivered in Orléans declared her corpse a vessel of demonic impurity, whose presence in consecrated space risked contaminating the church. Though such claims were politically motivated, they reflected widespread popular sentiment. In both Catholic and Protestant camps, Catherine was despised, if for different reasons, one side blaming her for the persecution of the Huguenots, the other for being too lenient on them. More unsettling still were the medical post-mortem reports leaked from within the palace. Although no formal autopsy was recorded, an internal memorandum circulated among the royal physicians noted the presence of internal putrefaction distension of the belly with malodorous gas and signs of corrupted matter in the lower entrails. Whether this was a genuine attempt at understanding her illness, or simply an effort to discredit her further in death, is unclear. But the language used was vivid and grotesque comparisons to rotting fruit descriptions of blackened organs and one line noting that the stench did thicken the air of the chapel. It was a macabre account, and it quickly became part of the whispered lore surrounding her death. The decision to leave her body in Blois had unintended consequences. Isolated from other royal remains and lacking the protection of sacred tradition, her tomb was uniquely vulnerable. In the decades that followed, as the French monarchy underwent transformation and revolution loomed on the horizon, such vulnerabilities would have terrible consequences. But even in the short term, the absence of a proper burial diminished Catherine's status. Her death, already overshadowed by decay and misfortune, now symbolized dynastic decline. This symbolism was not lost on observers. Foreign ambassadors noted in their dispatches that the Queen Mother lies above ground without procession, without priest, without public sorrow. Venetian envoys wrote of the disgraceful fate of a woman who once held all of France in her hand. To them, the image of a corpse moldering in a neglected chapel was not just tragic, it was emblematic of the monarchy's failure. And yet Catherine's remains lingered. They became a point of contention in diplomatic negotiations and internal court debates. Some argued for immediate transport and burial, others insisted on waiting for a restoration of royal strength. But no resolution came. Henry III himself would not survive the year. In August 1589, he was assassinated by a fanatical monk in Saint-Cloud. With his death, the direct Valois line came to an end. The new King Henry IV of Navarre, a former Huguenot who converted to Catholicism to gain the crown, had little incentive to honor Catherine's memory. She had opposed him politically, and her death had provided no path to peace. Though he later ordered the transfer of her body to Saint-Denis in 1610, over 2 decades after her death, it was an act of political expedience rather than personal reverence. By then, few cared. The court had changed. The monarchy had changed. France had changed. Yet in Blois, the memory of Catherine's neglected corpse lingered. Local legends grew. Children whispered that her ghost roamed the palace grounds. Some claimed that on cold January nights her silhouette could be seen in the chapel, seated beside her coffin, weeping silently. These were, of course, stories. But they spoke to a deeper truth that Catherine de Medici, the woman who had ruled France without wearing a crown, had been abandoned by the very state she built. Her death was not a fall from grace. It was a descent into obscurity wrought and quiet horror. And it was not yet finished. In the weeks following Catherine de Medici's death, the royal palace at Blois bore little resemblance to a seat of mourning. The chapel where her coffin sat poorly attended and sealed against the cold January air had become a grim footnote in the chaotic political theater unfolding around it. Far from ushering in a period of reflection, her passing occurred amid perhaps the most dangerous moment in Henry III's reign, one steeped in vengeance, suspicion, and blood. The atmosphere in Blois had already darkened in December 1588, just days before Catherine's death, when Henry III ordered the assassination of Henry, Duke of Guise, leader of the Catholic League. This event, staged within the very halls of the palace, was no mere political maneuver. It was a calculated execution intended to decapitate the League's influence and restore royal authority. Guise had been summoned under the pretense of negotiation. Instead, he was ambushed by royal guards and cut down in a side chamber. His body was immediately burned and buried in secret. This act sent a shockwave through France. The League erupted in outrage, seeing in the assassination not the restoration of monarchy, but the tyrannical desperation of a fading dynasty. To the League. Henry III had declared war on the Catholic faith. To the Huguenots, he remained untrustworthy. And to many nobles, he had revealed himself as a man who would not hesitate to kill even the most powerful of his subjects. As Catherine lay dying, the court became a landscape of locked doors, muffled conversations, and sword-bearing guards. The Queen Mother, once the court's primary stabilizer, had been powerless to stop the killing, and her death marked the final unraveling of whatever fragile equilibrium had remained. The psychological toll of the Guise assassination was apparent in the king. Henry III, known for his nocturnal rituals, erratic behavior, and elaborate courtly aestheticism, now leaned further into isolation. He held nightly councils in the Galerie des Serres, often lit only by candlelight and guarded by trusted men-at-arms. No decisions were made without layers of intrigue. Ministers suspected each other of betrayal. Some plotted quietly to defect to the League. Others wrote cautiously to foreign courts. The king's once glittering entourage shrank. By mid-January, Blois was no longer a palace, it was a trap. And yet in the midst of this rising paranoia, Catherine's coffin remained untouched in the chapel. There was no time for burial, no will for ceremony. In a place filled with daggers and whispered accusations, her corpse became a kind of political relic, an inconvenient reminder of a regime built on personal relationships and careful manipulation. One royal page wrote in a private letter, "The Queen Mother lies in silence, while the court devours itself in her absence." She was the hand that signed the page. Now the ink runs wild. A new kind of violence emerged in the palace, less overt than the slayings of Guise and his brother, but equally fatal. 80 Decomps disappeared overnight. A secretary was discovered dead in the river below the ramparts, his satchel emptied of all documents. The king moved his quarters to a different wing and installed multiple locks on his private doors. No one was trusted. Catherine's rooms were sealed, her possessions inventoried under suspicion that they might contain coded letters or poisons. During this chaos, the question of her burial became oddly taboo. Even those loyal to her legacy dared not speak too loudly about her unburied state. The chapel itself, according to one account, had become neglected. The guards posted outside were rotated daily to prevent them from learning too much or growing too curious. And yet stories leaked out. One anonymous pamphlet circulated in Tours claimed that Catherine's corpse had begun to rot through the wooden coffin, the fluids staining the chapel floor. This may have been exaggeration or deliberate slander, but it reflected the sense of horror associated with her lingering physical presence. What little respect remained for the dead Queen Mother was bound tightly to fear. Some courtiers insisted the coffin be moved. Others proposed a quiet burial in the palace gardens. Henry III refused. Whether out of devotion, denial, or superstition, he would not allow her to be buried outside of the royal necropolis. She was a queen in all but title, he reportedly told an advisor. She shall lie with kings. That defiance did not last long. By summer of 1589, Henry himself was facing the mortal consequences of his crumbling regime. On August 1st, he was stabbed by Jacques Clément, a Dominican monk radicalized by League propaganda. The assassin had been granted private access under the guise of delivering a message. Instead, he plunged a knife into the king's abdomen. Henry died the next morning, and with him the Valois line came to its abrupt and irrevocable end. With both mother and son dead within 7 months of each other, the palace at Blois was evacuated. Henry of Navarre, leader of the Huguenots and now de facto king, as Henry of Massacre did not immediately assume the throne in Paris, it remained hostile, a city of barricades and loyalist clergy. But he did begin consolidating power elsewhere. For Catherine's body, this meant continued neglect. In the confusion, her coffin was left behind the chapel, sealed and ignored. By the time royal envoys returned to the site months later, the damage was evident. The coffin's wooden structure had collapsed inward. Moisture from the stone floor had warped its base, and vermin had infested the linen wrappings. The remains were discolored, partially liquefied, and unrecognizable. The chapel itself had developed a musty stench, and one clerk wrote that the effluvia near the altar would not allow one to kneel without retching. Such descriptions, graphic as they are, underscore how the political fragmentation of France had physical consequences even for the dead. Catherine, who had lived in a world of perfumed courts and gilded thrones, had become part of a disturbing tableau, a royal corpse decaying in the heart of a palace steeped in violence and betrayal. Her body, once the vessel of dynastic strategy and maternal authority, was now something to be managed, cleaned, and moved in secret. There was no public outcry, no nobles petitioned for her interment. The monarchy was in transition, and Catherine de Medici had become an uncomfortable reminder of everything France wanted to forget: its wars of religion, its failed reconciliations, its dynasty built on assassination and fear. Only decades later would she be granted burial at Saint-Denis, long after the Revolution of 1589 had passed, and a new Bourbon monarchy had taken root. But even that gesture would not preserve her from further indignities. When Catherine de Medici's remains were finally transferred to the Basilica of Saint-Denis in 1610, more than 2 decades after her death, the act carried no ceremony. There were no parades, no royal decrees marking the occasion, and no public mourning. By then, the political landscape had shifted entirely. The Valois dynasty was gone, and the Bourbon monarchy under Henry IV had re-established royal authority on new ideological terms. Catherine, whose influence had once dictated court affairs and foreign alliances, was an afterthought, a relic of a failed era. Her coffin, already in advanced decay when it was first reopened in Blois, was handled with minimal care. Attendants reportedly used cloth soaked in wine and vinegar to mask the lingering odor and disinfect the surroundings. What remained of her body, discolored bone fragments, disintegrated linens, and sludgy organic residue was hurriedly gathered and sealed again for transport. The journey north to Saint-Denis was not a royal procession, but a logistical movement of remains. Annotations from royal archivists note simply that the late Queen Mother was brought to Saint-Denis in accordance with prior instruction. No further detail survives. Her final resting place was beside her husband Henry II in the Grand Necropolis, where French royalty had been buried for centuries. The tomb sculpted during her lifetime was a fittingly austere monument, Catherine and Henry carved in white marble hands folded in eternal prayer, their faces serene and composed. Yet the symbolism was hollow. The union had been marked by decades of distance and humiliation, with Henry famously keeping his mistress Diane de Poitiers closer in both affection and political influence. Still, Catherine had ordered the monument constructed herself, determined that history would remember them as a unified royal pair. And for a time the tomb stood unmolested as France recovered from its wars of religion and entered the relative stability of Bourbon rule. Catherine's legacy, however, did not improve. In official histories and popular memory alike, she was increasingly vilified. Protestant chroniclers condemned her as the architect of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Catholic partisans viewed her as an opportunist who had compromised with heresy. Even secular writers painted her as the manipulative Italian matron whose Machiavellian tactics had plunged France into decades of bloodshed. In the decades that followed, these accusations evolved into full-blown legends. Catherine was accused of conducting black masses, poisoning rivals, and maintaining secret torture chambers beneath the Louvre. These stories, largely fictional, reflected the fears of a nation still grappling with civil division and religious trauma. They also masked a deeper truth that her real crimes were of political calculus, not witchcraft. Yet the association between Catherine and the occult became persistent, helped along by her known consultations with astrologers like Cosimo Ruggeri and her interest in alchemy and divination. But the most horrifying chapter in her posthumous story would come with the French Revolution. In 1793, over 2 centuries after her death, a radical faction of the French revolutionary government, driven by a desire to eliminate all traces of monarchy and religious privilege, ordered the desecration of the royal tombs at Saint-Denis. The basilica, long a symbol of dynastic continuity, was declared a temple of reason. Its contents were removed, its windows shattered, and its crypts plundered. The tomb of Catherine de Medici was among the many destroyed. Her coffin was opened and its remains cast into a communal pit, along with those of other royals. Eyewitness accounts describe a scene of chaotic violence, bones, scattered corpses thrown into wagons, and marble effigies smashed to pieces. Revolutionaries jeered as they destroyed what they saw as the physical symbols of tyranny. Catherine's name, along with her likeness, was defaced. One account from the Revolutionary Committee of Saint-Denis describes a skeleton wrapped in rotted velvet, its skull crushed by the pressure of collapsed stone. Though it is impossible to verify whether this refers specifically to Catherine, the imagery was seized upon in the following years as a grim metaphor for monarchical decay. Her remains, once fiercely protected by royal guards and veiled behind incense and marble, were now indistinguishable from the rubble of history. The site of her mass grave was later marked, but her bones, like those of dozens of other monarchs, were never conclusively identified. When the Bourbon Restoration attempted to rehabilitate the royal necropolis in the early 19th century, many of the bones were reburied together in ossuaries, anonymous, disordered, and permanently divorced from their monuments. Catherine de Medici, who had spent her life mastering the mechanics of legacy and remembrance, was denied both in death. Her carefully crafted tomb became a pile of shards. Her body, once the centerpiece of royal ritual and political symbolism, was desecrated by the very forces she had feared might destroy France. The revolutionaries did not distinguish between good monarchs and bad. For them, the Valois name itself was a symbol of corruption, and Catherine its most infamous matriarch. And yet it is precisely this fate, death without dignity, memory without mercy, that gives her story its enduring horror. She had ruled without a crown, governed kings, navigated civil war and religious division with unrelenting will. She had outlived nearly all her children, watched France descend into chaos, and died amidst blood and betrayal. But even that suffering was not the end. Her final degradation came not from her enemies in court, but from generations later when her body was torn from its grave and thrown into the dirt. The Queen Mother had once believed that power could be preserved through dynasty monument and ritual. But as her shattered tomb attested, all of those things could be broken. With the desecration of Catherine de Medici's remains during the French Revolution, the last vestiges of her physical legacy were reduced to dust and obscurity. But her posthumous fate did not merely reflect the upheaval of revolutionary France. It underscored the total collapse of the dynastic order she had fought so ferociously to maintain. The story of Catherine's death and its aftermath, painful, undignified, and ultimately anonymous, was inseparable from the fate of the Valois line and from the unraveling of a political world she had once shaped with uncanny precision. Following the death of Henry III in 1589, the Valois dynasty came to its final breath. Catherine had spent her life threading power through her sons, only to see them die young, childless, or disgraced. Francis II, her eldest, died at 16. Charles IX descended into mental illness and died at 23, tormented by guilt over the Protestant massacres. Henry III, intelligent but erratic, was assassinated in his late 30s. Catherine's political engineering had delayed collapse, not prevented it. Without a male heir, the Valois name disappeared from the royal annals, replaced by the upstart Bourbon dynasty. Catherine's political legacy did not survive this transition. Henry IV, a former Protestant who famously declared that Paris is worth a mass upon converting to Catholicism, had no interest in glorifying the Queen Mother, who had long opposed his rise. For his regime, she was a symbol of dynastic corruption, religious ambiguity, and courtly manipulation, all things that the new monarchy needed to discard. Public references to her were minimized. Her political writings, which might have clarified her intentions or mitigated her reputation, were quietly archived or ignored. In the cultural memory of France, Catherine's image decayed as surely as her remains. By the 17th century, she was caricatured as the Italian poisoner, the sinister matriarch behind the worst excesses of Valois rule. Writers like Brantôme and later Alexandre Dumas in the 19th century gave her an aura of Gothic malice, an image of a woman mixing drafts in the dark, whispering to astrologers and pulling puppet strings from behind velvet drapes. These portrayals blurred the lines between fact and invention. Catherine had certainly been ruthless, calculating, and at times merciless. But she had also been a capable regent, a master negotiator, and one of the most effective female rulers of her age. Yet the truth offered little resistance to myth. Her foreign origin, Florentine, not French, made her an easy target for xenophobic suspicion. Her reliance on unorthodox advisors, including astrologers and physicians, trained in the Italian Renaissance tradition, allowed Protestant pamphleteers to brand her a witch. Her central role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre permanently scarred her reputation, especially as narratives hardened around the idea of an orchestrated Catholic genocide against Protestants. The complexities of the event, its political provocations, the panic of the court, and the spiraling urban violence were flattened into a singular image, Catherine giving the fatal nod. Her death, so pitiful and dehumanizing, seemed a fitting punishment to her critics. The grotesque details of her decline, the distended abdomen, the septic wounds, the stench of decay, were repeated in anti-Catholic literature across Europe as proof of divine judgment. One German tract from the early 1600s claimed that her belly burst from corruption, spilling forth her sin into God's house. Even French sources that defended the monarchy hesitated to absolve her. She became the emblem of a monarchy that had lost its moral compass. And yet in retrospect, it is possible to see the horror of Catherine's death not simply as retribution but as consequence. She had lived her life in defense of a system that was disintegrating around her. A court of shifting loyalties, factional violence, and dynastic rivalry made more combustible by religion and fear. The institutions that once legitimized monarchy, divine right, noble blood, ceremonial burial had begun to rot from within. Catherine saw this clearly and she fought it, not with idealism, but with control over her sons, over her ministers, over her enemies, and even over her own image. But power, even when expertly wielded, is finite. When her body finally gave way, there was no one left to carry the weight of her legacy. Her death came in squalor. Her corpse decayed in public shame, her memory fractured between villainy and silence. And in that unraveling, she became something larger than a single monarch. Catherine de Medici became a warning. In the centuries that followed, monarchs would cite her name with caution. Revolutionaries would point to her as proof of dynastic rot. Historians would debate her motives, her policies, her crimes. But few would forget the image of a once omnipotent queen mother dying in pain, her corpse abandoned, her tomb destroyed. It was not the death she imagined. It was not the death anyone expected. It was worse. The long arc of Catherine de Medici's life, marked by ambition, strategy, and brutal compromise, ended not in peace but in disintegration. Her death was not simply physical but symbolic, embodying the unraveling of the very institutions she had spent her life holding together. France, racked by religious war and dynastic fracture, offered no funeral or final rites fitting her status. Her legacy, like her remains, was left unprotected, scavenged by political adversaries, sensationalized by fiction, and warped by centuries of ideological reappraisal. Yet, despite her vilification, Catherine's significance in European history remains undeniable. She governed through Regency war and rebellion in an era when female political power was not merely rare, it was resented. She preserved royal authority through the catastrophic reigns of 3 sons, sustained court function during the worst periods of religious violence, and kept the state from total collapse for decades. Without her, the Valois monarchy might have fallen far sooner. And yet, for all her political acumen, she died surrounded by enemies. Her family line extinguished her country, teetering on the edge of revolution. In a cruel irony, the Queen Mother, whose life revolved around dynastic survival, was met with complete dynastic extinction. Her body was denied royal burial until long after her death, and even then her final resting place was desecrated, torn apart, not by rival nobles or foreign invaders, but by the very people she had once tried to govern. Catherine de Medici has become a figure of contradiction, a pragmatic ruler who embraced superstition, a patron of the arts remembered for political violence, a mother driven by loyalty whose actions led to massacre. But perhaps her most enduring legacy is the grim lesson her life imparts. That power, no matter how skillfully acquired or fiercely protected, cannot outlast the decay of the institutions that sustain it. And when those institutions fall, even the most powerful are not spared the grotesque indignities of history.